There are footprints in the New Mexico desert that shouldn't exist. They're preserved in ancient lake beds at White Sands, frozen in time like photographs from a world we weren't supposed to know about. Small footprints, some from children, others from teenagers and adults. You can see the impressions of toes, the way the mud squeezed up between them. You can track where people walked, where they stopped, where a mother set down her infant to rest. These aren't just any footprints. They're between 21,000 and 23,000 years old, and according to everything we thought we knew about human history in the Americas, they're impossible. For decades, scientists told us a clear story. The first people arrived in North America around 13,000 years ago, walking across a land bridge from Siberia during the last ice age. They were Homo sapiens, modern humans just like us, following herds of mammoth and bison into an empty continent. It was a neat timeline, clean, everyone agreed. Then came the footprints, and suddenly nothing was clean anymore. Because if people were walking across New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they arrived at least 10,000 years earlier than we thought possible. They were here when massive ice sheets still covered most of North America, when there was supposedly no way through, when the land bridge wasn't even passable yet. And here's where things get really strange. What if those footprints weren't left by people quite like us? Stay with me here. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. It's a question that serious scientists are now asking, based on evidence piling up from genetics labs, ancient burial sites, and mysterious skulls that don't quite match what modern humans should look like. What if multiple species of humans reach the Americas? What if Denisovans, that ghost species we only discovered a few years ago, made it here first? What if Neanderthals somehow crossed the Atlantic? The traditional story of the first Americans is crumbling, and underneath, we're finding something far more complex, far stranger, and infinitely more fascinating. If you're using this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these, so maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I love checking the comments and seeing Tokyo at lunch, Toronto at midnight, all experiencing this mystery together across time zones. Picture this. You're standing at White Sands National Park right now, looking down at those ancient footprints. The sun is setting over the white gypsum dunes. The shadows make the impressions easier to see, little indentations in rock that was once mud. The people who made these tracks were walking along the edge of a lake that dried up thousands of years ago. They were hunting giant ground sloths, massive creatures that would tower over a modern bear. We know this because there are ground sloth tracks right alongside the human ones. At one point you can see where a sloth reared up on its hind legs, probably startled by the approaching humans. This was a world of megafauna. Mammoths with curved tusks longer than a car, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, American lions bigger than anything alive today. And somehow, some group of humans was here, living among these creatures, leaving footprints that would last longer than empires. But who were they? That question is tearing apart everything we thought we understood about American prehistory. Because the more we dig, the weirder it gets. There are archaeological sites in Chile that might be 18,000 years old. Caves in Mexico with evidence of human occupation before the Ice Age corridor supposedly opened. Skulls in Brazil and California that look different, really different, from modern Native Americans. And then there's the genetic evidence. DNA from ancient remains showing traces of unknown human populations, ghost lineages that don't match any living group, hints of interbreeding between modern humans and other species, right here in the Americas. We're not just rewriting when people arrived. We're questioning who they were, whether they came once or many times, whether they walked, sailed, or somehow crossed oceans we thought were uncrossable, whether the first Americans might have been, in some fundamental way, a completely different species. This is a journey back through deep time, through ice ages that turned half the planet into frozen wasteland, through vanished land bridges and submerged coastlines, through archaeological sites that keep pushing the timeline back further and further, through genetic mysteries and ancient bones, and yes, those impossible footprints in the desert. The story we're about to tell isn't finished. Every year brings new discoveries that change the picture, but that's what makes it so incredible. We're watching human history being rewritten in real time, so let's start at the beginning, or what we thought was the beginning. For most of the 20th century, the story of America's first people seemed settled. It was elegant, it was simple, and it made perfect sense. Around 13,000 years ago, during the last ice age, groups of Siberian hunters followed herds of mammoth and bison across a vast land bridge that connected Asia to Alaska. They spread southward through an ice-free corridor, rapidly colonized 2 empty continents, and became the ancestors of all Native Americans. Case closed. This theory, known as Clovis-first, dominated textbooks, shaped museum exhibits, and defined entire careers. It wasn't just scientific consensus. It became something close to archaeological dogma. Anyone who questioned it risked professional ridicule. But here's the thing about scientific orthodoxy. Sometimes it's right, and sometimes it's just comfortable. Let's start with what we know for certain. During the last ice age, roughly between 30,000 and 11,000 years ago, massive ice sheets covered much of North America and Eurasia. We're not talking about a few extra feet of snow. These were ice walls 2 miles thick in places, grinding across the landscape, locking up so much water that global sea levels dropped by 400 feet. When you remove 400 feet of water from the ocean, geography changes dramatically. Shallow seas become dry land. Islands connect to mainlands, and most importantly for our story, a narrow strait between Siberia and Alaska transforms into something else entirely. Beringia, the Bering Land Bridge. Picture this in your mind. Not a narrow pathway or a temporary ice bridge, a subcontinent, 1,000 miles wide from north to south, stretching from eastern Siberia to western Alaska. Grassland tundra as far as the eye could see, broken by river valleys and scattered groves of trees in the more sheltered areas. This wasn't some frozen wasteland. Archaeological and geological evidence shows Beringia was a remarkably productive environment. Cold, yes, but dry and relatively stable. The kind of place where large animals could thrive, and thrive they did. Mammoths moved across these grasslands in enormous herds. Not just any mammoths, but woolly mammoths perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions, with fur coats up to 3 feet thick and curved tusks that could sweep aside snow to reach the grass beneath. Ancient horses grazed alongside them, different from modern horses, stockier and more cold-adapted. Steppe bison, twice the size of modern buffalo, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions that made modern African lions look small. This was a lost world, an entire ecosystem that has no modern equivalent, and according to the traditional story, it was across this landscape that humans first entered the Americas. The people who made this journey were hunters, sophisticated, skilled, carrying technologies that had been refined over thousands of years in Siberia. They weren't deliberately exploring or conquering new continents. They were just following food. When the mammoth herds moved, they moved. When the bison migrated, they followed. At some point, probably without even realizing it, some of these hunting groups crossed from Asia into Alaska. The land looked the same on both sides. The animals were the same. There was no border, no sense of having entered a new world. Just more grassland, more game, more opportunities. For perhaps thousands of years, these populations remained in Alaska and Beringia, hunting and living much as they had in Siberia. But to the south, Something was changing. The ice sheets that covered Canada were beginning to retreat, and as they melted back, they opened a narrow corridor between the massive Cordilleran ice sheet covering the western mountains and the even larger Laurentide ice sheet covering most of central and eastern Canada. This ice-free corridor, running roughly along the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, became the supposed gateway to the rest of the Americas. According to the traditional model, once this pathway opened around 13,500 years ago, the hunters moved south. Fast. And here's where the Clovis culture enters the story. Starting in the 1930s, archaeologists began finding distinctive stone spear points across North America. These weren't crude tools. They were masterpieces of stone-working technology. Each Clovis point was carefully shaped from high-quality stone, often transported from quarries hundreds of miles away. They featured a distinctive fluted base where a channel had been carefully removed from each side, creating a groove that allowed the point to be securely attached to a wooden shaft. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Creating a Clovis point required understanding stone fracture mechanics at an intuitive level, planning each strike precisely, knowing exactly how much force to apply and at what angle. A single mistake could shatter hours of work. Yet these points were made in such quantities that archaeologists have found thousands of them scattered across the continent. More importantly, they were found in association with mammoth kills, sites where these ancient hunters had cornered and slaughtered Ice Age megafauna. The evidence seemed clear. These were specialized big game hunters, following mammoth herds across the landscape, armed with the most sophisticated hunting technology of their age. The theory was beautiful in its simplicity. Humans arrived around 13,000 years ago. They brought Clovis technology with them or developed it soon after arrival. They spread rapidly across 2 continents, following the herds, eventually reaching the southern tip of South America within just a few thousand years. One migration, one technology, one founding population. It explained everything archaeologists were finding. The widespread distribution of Clovis points, their relative uniformity across vast distances, the timing that coincided perfectly with the opening of the ice-free corridor. Even the disappearance of many Ice Age megafauna species seemed to fit. Perhaps these super-efficient hunters had driven mammoths and other large animals to extinction shortly after arrival. For decades, this model dominated American archaeology. It was taught in every university. It appeared in every textbook. Museums built entire exhibits around it. The Clovis-first hypothesis wasn't just accepted, it was assumed. Any archaeological site that claimed to be older than Clovis faced immediate skepticism. The burden of proof was enormous. Dates had to be perfect. Artifacts had to be unquestionable. Context had to be absolutely secure. Even then, most pre-Clovis claims were dismissed, sometimes without serious examination. This wasn't necessarily bad science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And there had been false alarms before, sites that initially seemed ancient but turned out to be younger than thought. Artifacts that looked human-made but proved to be naturally fractured rocks. Dates contaminated by older carbon that made young sites appear ancient. Archaeologists had learned to be cautious, maybe too cautious. Because even during the height of Clovis orthodoxy there were problems. Little anomalies that didn't quite fit the model, sites in South America that seemed to date to the same period as Clovis or even earlier. How had people reached the southern tip of South America so quickly? Stone tool traditions in some regions that looked nothing like Clovis, suggesting different technologies or different populations, and perhaps most puzzling, genetic studies of Native American populations that hinted at deeper, more complex origins. But these concerns were largely dismissed or explained away. The ice-free corridor had opened around 13,500 years ago. Clovis appeared around 13,000 years ago. The timing worked. The The story made sense, until it didn't. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in science isn't being wrong. It's being so convinced you're right that you stop looking for evidence that might prove otherwise. And in the case of America's first peoples, that evidence was waiting to be found. In ancient footprints, in coastal caves, in the DNA of modern populations, in sites that predated Clovis by thousands of years. The traditional story was about to collapse, but it would take decades of controversial finds and bitter academic battles before anyone was ready to listen. For decades, the Clovis-first model seemed solid. The dating was consistent, the artifacts were widespread, the logic made sense. Humans crossed Beringia 13,000 years ago, moved south through the ice-free corridor, and became the Clovis people. Case closed, textbooks written, careers built on that foundation. But science doesn't care about consensus. It cares about evidence. And the evidence was starting to whisper things that nobody wanted to hear. The first real crack appeared in 1977, not in North America where everyone was looking, but at the opposite end of the hemisphere. In southern Chile, nearly 10,000 miles from the Bering Strait, archaeologist Tom Dillehay began excavating a site called Monte Verde. What he found there would eventually tear the Clovis-first theory to pieces. Monte Verde sits along a creek in the Chilean highlands, a quiet place where water and peat had worked together to do something remarkable. They'd preserved an ancient campsite so completely that archaeologists could identify not just stone tools, but wooden artifacts, animal hides, even fragments of wild potato and medicinal plants. The preservation was extraordinary, almost unprecedented. You could see where people had built shelters, where they'd processed food, where children had played near the water's edge. But it was the dates that caused the real problem. Radiocarbon dating put the main occupation layer at 14,500 years old, 1,000 years older than Clovis, and 10,000 miles south of where the Bering Strait crossing would have deposited the first Americans. Do the math. If Clovis people entered North America 13,000 years ago, how did their ancestors reach southern Chile 14,500 years ago? The numbers didn't work. Unless humans had been in the Americas much, much earlier than anyone thought. The archaeological establishment didn't want to hear it. Dillehay was challenged at every turn. Critics questioned his dating methods, his artifact identifications, his excavation techniques. Some suggested the wooden tools weren't tools at all, just pieces of wood shaped by water and time. Others claimed contamination had skewed the radiocarbon dates. The resistance was fierce, almost personal. But Dillehay kept working. He invited critics to visit the site to examine the evidence themselves. He published detailed reports, responded to every challenge, refined his methods. And slowly, grudgingly, the evidence became impossible to ignore. By 1997, a special visit by prominent archaeologists concluded that Monte Verde was legitimate. Humans had definitely been there 14,500 years ago. The Clovis barrier had been broken, except it wasn't just Monte Verde. Once archaeologists started looking seriously at pre-Clovis possibilities, other sites emerged from the shadows, sites that had been dismissed or ignored because they didn't fit the accepted timeline. Sites that suddenly demanded reconsideration. Take Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. Excavated in the 1970s by James Adovasio, this rock overhang near Pittsburgh produced layer after layer of human occupation stretching back in time. The deepest layers, where the oldest artifact appeared, dated to 16,000 years ago, maybe older. The site was meticulously excavated, with careful stratigraphic control and multiple dating methods. Adovasio documented everything: stone tools, fire pits, plant remains, animal bones. The stratigraphy was clear, undisturbed, consistent. Everything suggested continuous human occupation from the Ice Age right up to historical times. But 16,000 years ago? That was 3,000 years before Clovis. The archaeological community wasn't ready for that. Critics argued that coal deposits in the area might have contaminated the radiocarbon samples, making them appear older than they really were. But Adovasio had anticipated this. He'd taken samples from materials unlikely to absorb ancient carbon, used multiple dating laboratories, cross-checked his results with different methodologies. The dates held up. Still, the controversy continued for decades. Even after Monteverde gained acceptance, Meadowcroft remained disputed too far outside the comfort zone. Then there was the Topper site in South Carolina. Archaeologist Al Goodyear had been excavating there since the 1980s, finding a nice Clovis layer that fit perfectly with established chronology. But in 1998, he decided to dig deeper, just to see what was below the Clovis horizon. What he found challenged everything. Beneath the Clovis layer, separated by sterile sediment, was another layer of what appeared to be stone tools, thousands of them, flakes, blades, possible points, and the dating suggested they were 50,000 years old. 50,000 years. That wasn't just pre-Clovis. That was before modern humans had even left Africa in the accepted timeline. That was contemporary with Neanderthals in Europe. The response was predictable. Most archaeologists simply refused to consider it. The artifacts weren't really tools, they said, just rocks broken by natural processes. The dating must be wrong. The stratigraphy must be confused. Anything except the possibility that humans had been in South America 50,000 years ago. Goodyear expected the skepticism. He even understood it. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But he kept excavating, kept dating, kept documenting. The evidence didn't go away just because people didn't want to believe it. But perhaps the most compelling pre-Clovis evidence came from an unlikely source. Not stone tools or campsite remains, but human waste. In the Paisley Caves of south-central Oregon, archaeologist Dennis Jenkins found something that couldn't be easily dismissed or reinterpreted. Coprolites, fossilized human feces dating to 14,300 years ago. Now, coprolites might sound unglamorous, but they're archaeological gold. Unlike stone tools, which critics can argue might be natural formations, or wooden artifacts, which can be questioned as contamination, coprolites are unambiguous. They're distinctly human, and the ones from Paisley Caves contained human DNA, confirmed through genetic analysis. Not just any DNA, but distinctly Native American genetic markers. These weren't Clovis people. These were their predecessors, living in North America more than 1,000 years before Clovis culture appeared. The coprolites also contained plant and animal remains that provided a window into these people's diet. They were eating fish, waterfowl, small mammals, and a variety of plant foods. They knew the landscape, understood seasonal availability, possessed the knowledge to survive in the high desert environment of Ice Age Oregon. This wasn't a brief visit or accidental presence. This was established occupation by people who knew what they were doing. The DNA evidence was particularly significant. Critics could dispute stone tool identifications or argue about radiocarbon dates, but genetic material doesn't lie. These samples weren't contaminated by modern DNA. They showed clear ancestry linked to Native American populations, and they were definitively 14,300 years old. The dating was cross-checked with multiple methods, the genetic analysis confirmed by independent laboratories. This was solid, undeniable evidence of pre-Clovis human presence in North America. But why had it taken so long for these sites to gain acceptance? Why the decades of resistance, the dismissals, the career-damaging controversies? Part of it was simple scientific conservatism. any established theory develops a kind of momentum, an institutional weight that's hard to overcome. Researchers build careers on the accepted model, textbooks get written, museum displays get designed, academic reputations become invested in the status quo. Challenging that requires not just good evidence, but overwhelming evidence. Evidence so strong it can't be ignored or explained away. There was also a methodological issue. Pre-Clovis sites are inherently harder to identify and interpret than Clovis sites. They're older, more weathered, less well preserved. The artifacts are often simpler, more difficult to distinguish from naturally broken rocks. Dating becomes trickier as you push back beyond the reliable range of radiocarbon methods. Every additional layer of uncertainty gives critics more ammunition, more reasons to remain skeptical. And honestly, some of the early claims of pre-Clovis occupation had been poorly supported. Over-enthusiastic researchers seeing artifacts in natural rock formations, misinterpreting stratigraphic sequences, contaminating radiocarbon samples. These false alarms made the legitimate discoveries harder to accept. The archaeological community had been burned before. They weren't eager to be burned again. But by the early 2000s, the weight of evidence had become impossible to ignore. Monteverde was accepted. Paisley Caves provided genetic confirmation. Even skeptical researchers had to acknowledge that something was wrong with the Clovis-first model. Humans had been in the Americas before Clovis, maybe not 50,000 years before, as the topocite suggested, but definitely 14,000 to 16,000 years before present. That was established fact, which raised a whole new set of questions. If people were here before Clovis, who were they? Where did they come from? How did they get here? The ice-free corridor wouldn't have been passable at 14,500 years ago. The glaciers were still at their maximum extent, blocking any land route from Beringia into the heart of North America. So how did Monteverde's inhabitants reach Chile? How did the Paisley Caves people get to Oregon? And perhaps most intriguingly, why did these earlier people leave such a faint archaeological signature? Clovis sites are everywhere once you know what to look for. Distinctive points, consistent tool-making techniques, widespread distribution. But pre-Clovis sites are rare, scattered, difficult to identify. Were these earlier populations much smaller? Were they using different technologies that don't preserve well or are harder to recognize? Or were they fundamentally different kinds of people, practicing different life ways, perhaps even representing different waves of migration? The cracks in the timeline had revealed something unexpected. The story of the first Americans wasn't simple. It wasn't a single crossing, a single people, a single clear narrative. It was messy, complicated, full of gaps and mysteries and possibilities that challenged everything researchers thought they knew. And the evidence was about to get even stranger. So let's go back to those footprints. But this time, we're going to slow down. We're going to really see what they represent, what they tell us, why they've turned everything we thought we knew about American prehistory completely upside down. Imagine White Sands, New Mexico, 23,000 years ago. But it's not the desert you see today. Back then, during the height of the last ice age, this was a completely different place. Where now you have gypsum dunes and scrubland, there was a massive lake, Lake Otero, fed by glacial meltwater streaming down from the mountains. The shoreline stretched for miles, a rare oasis in an otherwise cold, harsh landscape. The Ice Age hadn't made the Southwest uniformly frozen. No mammoths grazing on frozen tundra here. Instead, temperatures were cooler than today, maybe 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit lower. The landscape was grassland punctuated by stands of pine and spruce, and around the lake shores, where water met land, there was mud, lots of mud, the kind of soft, wet sediment that holds impressions beautifully. People came here, not just once or twice, but regularly. They came to hunt the giant ground sloths that browsed on the vegetation. They came to fish in the shallow waters. They came to gather seeds and roots from the plants that thrived in the moist lakeside environment. And as they walked along the muddy shores, they left their marks. A woman, probably in her 20s, based on the foot size, walking south along the beach. Her footprints show a steady, purposeful stride. She's not running, not hunting, just travelling. Maybe heading to meet another group, maybe checking trap lines, maybe just walking the way humans have walked for hundreds of thousands of years. Beside her tracks there are smaller ones. A teenager, by the looks of it, keeping pace with the adult. Not a child's tentative steps, but the longer stride of someone entering adulthood. Were they mother and daughter, aunt and niece, teacher and student? We'll never know. But they were together, walking the same path at the same time. And then there are the children. Oh, the children. Their footprints are everywhere in the white sands trackways. Small prints running, jumping, playing. Sometimes they go in circles like kids chasing each other. Sometimes they show evidence of slipping and sliding in the mud, the kind of mess that would have made their parents shake their heads. One trackway shows what must have been a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, making a long journey across the mud flats. But they weren't alone. A larger set of prints, an adult, appears alongside the child's tracks periodically. The pattern suggests the adult was checking on the child, making sure they were okay, then wandering off to do something else, then checking back again. It's parenting. 23,000-year-old evidence of an adult keeping an eye on a kid while they explored. The footprints themselves are remarkably well preserved. You can see toe impressions, the curve of the arch, sometimes even the way weight shifts from heel to toe during the stride. These aren't vague depressions. These are detailed records of individual human beings, their anatomy, their movement patterns, even hints about their behavior and relationships. But here's what makes preservation like this possible. The timing had to be perfect. People walk across the wet mud at the lake edge. Within hours, maybe a day or two, the mud dries slightly in the sun and wind, hardening just enough to maintain the impression. Then before erosion can destroy the prints, another layer of sediment gets deposited on top. Maybe the lake level rises temporarily. Maybe a storm blows in fine sand. Maybe nearby springs overflow. Whatever the cause, the footprints get buried and protected. This cycle repeats over and over. Walk, harden, bury. Walk, harden, bury. Layer upon layer of footprints separated by thin bands of sediment, building up over hundreds or even thousands of years. Eventually, the entire sequence gets buried deeply enough that it's protected from erosion for millennia. What we see today is only visible because modern erosion has started uncovering these ancient layers. Wind scours away the overlying sediments, exposing footprint surfaces that haven't seen daylight since the Ice Age. If researchers hadn't found them when they did, wind erosion would have destroyed them within a few years. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Those sediment layers that buried and preserved the footprints, they contained seeds. Specifically, seeds from aquatic plants that grew in and around Lake Otero. Ditch grass seeds, mostly. Rupia cirrhosa, a plant that grows in shallow wetlands and brackish waters. Seeds are made of organic material. An organic material contains carbon, including the radioactive isotope carbon-14. Every living thing on Earth absorbs carbon-14 from the atmosphere while it's alive. But the moment something dies, that process stops. The carbon-14 starts decaying at a predictable rate, with a half-life of about 5,730 years. Measure how much carbon-14 is left in something organic, and you can calculate how long ago it died. The researchers collected dozens of these seeds from the sediment layers directly above and below the footprint horizons. They sent them to multiple radiocarbon dating laboratories to ensure accuracy and reproducibility. Then they waited for the results. The dates came back, and they were shocking. 21,000 years ago, 22,000 years ago. Some footprint layers dated to 23,000 years ago. Let that sink in for a moment. 23,000 years ago. That's not slightly older than Clovis. That's not a little bit before the ice-free corridor opened. That's nearly 10,000 years before the Clovis culture appeared. That's during the last glacial maximum, the absolute height of the Ice Age, when glaciers covered most of Canada and the northern United States with ice sheets up to 2 miles thick. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Northwest. The Laurentian ice sheet covered everything from the Atlantic coast to the eastern edge of the Rockies. Between them, for most of the last glacial maximum, there was no corridor, no passage, no way through. The ice sheets merged, creating an impenetrable wall of frozen water that stretched from ocean to ocean. And yet here were humans, in New Mexico, living their lives, raising their children, hunting giant sloths, walking along lake shores, not just briefly passing through either. The multiple footprint layers spanning thousands of years suggest repeated occupation. These weren't lost explorers who accidentally stumbled into the Americas and died out. This was a viable population, surviving and thriving in Ice Age America while glaciers blocked the traditional entry route. The scientific community's reaction was predictable. Skepticism bordering on disbelief. Radiocarbon dating isn't perfect, critics pointed out. Maybe the seeds were contaminated. Maybe they were older than the footprints and got mixed in somehow. Maybe the dates were just wrong. So the researchers went back. They collected more seeds. They dated more layers. They used multiple dating methods. They brought in outside experts to verify their techniques. Every single test confirmed the original findings. The footprints were genuine. The dates were accurate. Humans were in the Americas during the last glacial maximum. Some researchers tried to argue that maybe the ice-free corridor opened briefly during this period, just long enough for people to slip through. But glaciologists shut that down fast. Ice core data, geological evidence, climate reconstructions, all of it confirmed that the corridor was sealed tight from about 26,000 years ago until around 14,000 years ago. There was no brief opening. There was no possible way through. Others suggested maybe people came before the glaciers merged, then got trapped south of the ice sheets. But that creates its own problems. Genetic data shows that the ancestors of Native Americans were living in Beringia, the land connection between Siberia and Alaska, during precisely this period. They weren't isolated south of the ice sheets. They were still connected to Asian populations. The DNA doesn't lie. The implications are staggering. If people were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they had to get there somehow. And if the ice-free corridor was closed, there's only one other option. They came along the coast, not across the land bridge and down through Canada, along the Pacific shoreline, possibly using boats, staying in coastal refuges where glaciers hadn't quite reached the ocean. This completely changes the story. The traditional narrative has humans as land-based big game hunters, following mammoths and bison through the ice-free corridor. But coastal people would have been something different. Maritime adapted populations, skilled in boat building and sea mammal hunting, collecting shellfish and fishing in the rich waters of the Pacific Rim. A completely different survival strategy. A completely different culture. And it raises even more questions. How long had people been using this coastal route? If they were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, when did they first arrive? Were there earlier migrations that we haven't found evidence for yet? How many waves of migration were there? The White Sands footprints don't answer these questions. What they do is prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, that the traditional story is wrong. Humans didn't first enter the Americas 13,000 years ago through an ice-free corridor. They were here much earlier, arriving by routes we're only beginning to understand. Those footprints, those simple impressions in ancient mud, they're not just evidence. They're a revolution. They've forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the peopling of the Americas, and they've opened up possibilities that once seemed impossible, alternative routes, earlier dates, different migration stories. But here's the beautiful part, those footprints are also profoundly human. They show us people living their lives, completely unaware they were doing anything remarkable. They didn't know they were pioneers. They didn't know they were proving anything to anyone. They were just walking along a lakeshore, watching their children play, going about the business of survival in a world that would have seemed strange and dangerous and beautiful all at once. 23,000 years later, we can still see where they stepped. We can measure their stride length, estimate their height, imagine their lives. And in doing so, we're connected across an almost incomprehensible span of time to people who were fundamentally just like us. Human beings making their way in an uncertain world, leaving marks that would last far longer than they could ever have imagined. But what if we've been looking in all the wrong places? What if the first Americans didn't walk across frozen tundra at all? What if they sailed? Picture the Pacific coast during the last ice age. Not the coast you know today, with its beaches and harbour towns, but the ancient coastline as it existed 15,000 years ago. Sea levels were 400 feet lower than today. All that water locked up in continental ice sheets. The coastline extended miles beyond the modern shore, creating a vast shelf of exposed land that stretched from Alaska to California and beyond. And along that entire expanse ran something extraordinary, an underwater forest so dense, so rich with life, that it created a marine highway stretching thousands of miles. The kelp forests of the Ice Age Pacific. If you've ever seen a kelp forest, you know they're not really forests in any traditional sense. They're underwater jungles of giant brown algae that can grow 2 feet per day, rising from the seafloor to create dense canopies at the surface. Each kelp plant becomes its own ecosystem, home to hundreds of species of fish, invertebrates, and marine mammals. During the Ice Age, these forests were even more extensive than today. The exposed continental shelf created perfect conditions for kelp growth. Shallow waters, rocky substrates, nutrient-rich currents flowing up from the depths. From what is now Alaska, down the coast through British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, all the way to Mexico and beyond, the kelp forests thrived. And they were full of food. Not just full, absolutely teeming with calories just waiting to be harvested. Sea otters paddled through the kelp fronds, so numerous that some scientists think Ice Age populations might have been 10 times larger than today's depleted numbers. Harbour seals and sea lions hauled out on rocky shores to breed and rest. Fish swarmed in massive schools, herring, salmon, rockfish, halibut. Shellfish carpeted the intertidal zones, mussels, clams, sea urchins, abalone. And in the kelp forests themselves, octopus, crabs, and thousands of other edible species. For people who understood this environment, who developed the skills to exploit maritime resources, this coast would have been paradise. Not a barrier to be crossed, but a highway to be followed. A protein-rich corridor that led from Asia to the Americas without ever having to venture into the frozen interior. This is the Kelp Highway hypothesis, the idea that the first Americans were maritime specialists who followed the Pacific coast southward from Asia, island hopping across the Bering region when it was a complex archipelago rather than a land bridge, then continuing down the coast in boats. It sounds radical. But the more we look at the evidence, the more sense it makes. Consider the timing problem. The White Sands footprints date 23,000 years ago, but the ice-free corridor through Canada didn't open until about 14,000 years ago. For people to reach New Mexico that early by land, they would have had to somehow navigate through or around the massive ice sheets. But along the coast was always open. Even during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, the Pacific coastal route remained ice-free, kept temperate by ocean currents. Consider also the skill set. We've always assumed the first Americans were big game hunters, following mammoths and bison. But what if they were fishermen? What if they were people who had spent thousands of years perfecting maritime technologies along the coasts of Asia? The archaeological evidence for this is frustratingly sparse, but that's exactly what you'd expect if people had lived primarily along a coastline that is now 400 feet underwater. Think about that for a moment. Every coastal camp, every shell midden, every beach where ancient Americans launched boats or processed fish or taught their children to swim, all of it is gone, drowned when the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose. The entire archaeological record of coastal adaptation has been buried beneath hundreds of feet of ocean. We're not looking for a needle in a haystack. We're looking for a needle in a haystack that's been submerged for 10,000 years. But there are clues, places where ancient sites survived because they were on islands that stayed above water even as sea levels rose. And one of the most remarkable is the Channel Islands off the coast of California. Today, the Channel Islands are separated from the mainland by miles of ocean. But during the Ice Age, sea levels were so much lower that the 4 northern islands formed a single large landmass called Santa Rosae. And on this island lived something that shouldn't have been possible to reach: pygmy mammoths. These weren't full-sized mammoths. They were miniaturized versions that had evolved in isolation on the island, standing only about 6 feet tall at the shoulder. And humans were hunting them. Archaeological sites on the Channel Islands contain mammoth bones with butchery marks dating back at least 13,000 years. But here's the thing. Even at the lowest sea levels, Santa Rosae was still separated from the mainland by about 5 miles of open ocean. These people weren't walking to the island, they were sailing. With enough boats and enough confidence in their maritime skills to transport entire communities across open water to hunt pygmy elephants. This wasn't primitive technology. This was sophisticated seafaring, and there's more evidence from even further across the Pacific. In Japan, the Jomon culture developed one of the most elaborate maritime adaptations in the ancient world. By 16,000 years ago, they were building sophisticated boats, creating fish hooks from bone and shell, and developing ceramic technology to process marine resources. Some of their sites show evidence of open ocean voyaging. They were reaching islands that required travelling dozens of miles across open water. They understood currents, winds, navigation. They had developed a complete maritime toolkit that would have made coastal migration not just possible, but relatively straightforward. Could similar technologies have existed along the Asian coast even earlier? Could groups of maritime specialists have been following kelp forests and coastal resources from Asia into the Americas thousands of years before anyone thought to look for them inland? The genetic evidence is starting to suggest exactly that. Some Native American populations show genetic markers that are most closely related to coastal populations in Asia, not interior groups. This suggests their ancestors might have followed a coastal route rather than crossing through the interior. But finding the proof is almost impossibly difficult. Underwater archaeology is expensive, time-consuming, and technically challenging. You can't just walk around looking for artifacts like you can on land. You need sonar, submersibles, remote-operated vehicles. You need to know exactly where to look in an ocean that has rearranged sediments for 10,000 years. Despite these challenges, some teams are trying. Off the coast of British Columbia, archaeologists have been using traditional knowledge from First Nations peoples to identify promising underwater locations. These indigenous communities have oral histories of places that were once above water, ancient village sites now submerged. In some locations they've found artifacts, stone tools emerging from underwater sediments, wooden stakes that might be remnants of fish traps. Nothing definitive yet, but tantalizing hints of what might lie beneath. Off the California coast, other teams are using high-resolution sonar to map the submerged continental shelf, looking for features that might indicate human habitation, river mouths that would have been attractive settlement locations. shallow areas where kelp forests would have thrived, natural harbours protected from waves. Every so often, they find something interesting, an unusual concentration of rocks that might be a fish trap, a linear feature that could be a canoe run. But confirming these features as archaeological sites requires direct investigation, and that means expensive diving operations in conditions that are often dangerous. It's like trying to excavate a site while wearing a spacesuit in zero gravity. Everything takes 10 times longer and costs 100 times more than land archaeology. But what if they do find definitive evidence? What if somewhere off the coast of Alaska or British Columbia, archaeologists discover an intact settlement site, preserved by cold waters and buried sediments? A site with boats, fish processing areas, maritime tools, maybe even organic remains that could be dated? It would rewrite everything we think we know about the peopling of the Americas. The first Americans would transform from intrepid mammoth hunters braving the frozen wastes to skilled mariners navigating one of the richest ecosystems on Earth. The journey to the Americas wouldn't be a desperate trek across hostile tundra, but a gradual expansion along a familiar coastal environment, similar to the one they'd known in Asia. It would also explain how people reach South America so quickly. Following the coast, you could travel from Alaska to Chile in a matter of years or decades, not millennia. No need to adapt to new interior environments, learn new hunting techniques, figure out new survival strategies. Just keep following the kelp forests south, harvesting familiar resources, stopping to establish camps in particularly productive locations. Some groups might have moved inland from this coastal highway, following rivers up into the continent's interior. Others might have stayed on the coast for generations, developing increasingly specialized maritime adaptations. The diversity of early American cultures might reflect these different strategies, coastal specialists and interior hunters diverging from a common maritime ancestry. But until we find those underwater sites, until we can actually excavate and study the remains of coastal settlements, the Kelp Highway remains a hypothesis. Compelling, well-reasoned, supported by indirect evidence, but still unproven. The ocean keeps its secrets well, and the first Americans, if they were indeed maritime peoples, left their most important archaeological sites in the one place we can barely reach. 400 feet down, buried under millennia of sediment, waiting for technology and funding and luck to align. Somewhere out there, beyond the breakers and beneath the kelp forests that still thrive along the Pacific coast, the evidence might be waiting. Ancient boats preserved in anoxic sediments, fishing camps frozen in time, the proof that would transform our understanding of human migration and maritime capability. But there's another theory, one even more controversial than coastal migration, one that suggests the first Americans might not have come from Asia at all. Now here's where things get really weird, and controversial, and politically charged in ways that have nothing to do with science, and everything to do with modern identity politics. Some archaeologists have proposed something that sounds absolutely insane at first. What if the first Americans didn't come from Asia at all? What if they came from Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean, during the Ice Age, 20,000 years ago? This is called the Solutrean hypothesis, and it's based on one simple, undeniable, extremely puzzling observation. Some of the oldest stone tools found in North America look remarkably similar to tools made by people living in Ice Age France and Spain. Not just vaguely similar, nearly identical in some cases. Let me paint you a picture. It's 21,000 years ago, southern France. A group of people we call the Solutreans are living through the last glacial maximum, the coldest period of the last ice age. They've developed a distinctive technology, a method of making stone tools that's unlike anything else in the world at that time. They create these beautiful laurel leaf points, thin, symmetrical, pressure flaked with incredible skill. Some are so thin and delicate they couldn't possibly have been used as weapons. They're art pieces, demonstrations of skill, possibly ritual objects. These Solutrean tools appear around 22,000 years ago and last until about 17,000 years ago. Then the tradition disappears, replaced by other technologies as the climate warms and cultures change. Now jump across the Atlantic, North America, around 13,000 years ago. Suddenly across the continent a new tool technology appears. Clovis points. Beautiful, symmetrical, fluted projectile points with distinctive grooves running up from the base. They're made using sophisticated pressure flaking techniques, and to some archaeologists they look suspiciously similar to those Solutrean points from France. Not identical, but similar enough to suggest a connection. The flaking patterns, the symmetry, the careful preparation of the stone cores, the overall aesthetic. Could this be coincidence? Could two completely separate populations on opposite sides of the ocean independently develop nearly identical stoneworking techniques? Sure, convergent evolution happens in technology just like it does in biology. There are only so many ways to make an effective spear point after all. But the proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis say the similarities are too specific, too detailed to be coincidental. They argue there must have been contact, that somehow, some way, people from Ice Age Europe made it to North America thousands of years before the Clovis culture appeared. Here's how they imagine it might have happened. During the last glacial maximum, so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels dropped by more than 400 feet. But that's not the most important part. The most important part is the ice itself. The Atlantic Ocean was partially frozen. Not completely, not solid ice from shore to shore, but there was a massive ice sheet extending from Greenland down along the edge of what's now the Canadian Maritime Provinces. This ice edge created a unique ecosystem, a narrow zone where the ocean met the glacier, where seals hauled out onto the ice to give birth, where seabirds nested on icebergs, where fish congregated in the cold, nutrient-rich waters. The Solutrean hypothesis suggests that European hunters, people already adapted to Arctic conditions, began exploiting this ice edge environment, following the seals, living on the ice during summer months the way Inuit peoples would do thousands of years later. Maybe at first they just ventured a few miles out, then a few dozen miles, generation by generation, pushing further along the ice edge, always following the seals and seabirds that were their food source. Eventually, maybe over hundreds or thousands of years, some of these groups would have reached the coast of North America. Not through any conscious voyage of exploration, just gradually, incrementally, expanding their range along a continuous ice edge habitat that happened to stretch from Europe to America. It's not actually as crazy as it sounds. We know the Inuit travelled enormous distances across Arctic sea ice. We know that Norse sailors reached North America around 1000 CE using much more primitive boats than you might think. We know that humans are capable of incredible feats of navigation and survival in extreme environments. And the proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis can point to some intriguing evidence beyond just the stone tools. Some of the pre-Clovis sites on the east coast of North America, places like Cactus Hill in Virginia and Miles Point in Maryland, have yielded tools that look more European than Asian in their construction techniques. There are also some skeletal remains from early North America that show physical features more common in European populations than in Asian ones, though this evidence is highly disputed and controversial. So why don't most archaeologists accept this hypothesis? Why is it relegated to the fringes of the discipline, discussed in hushed tones at conferences, treated as almost heretical by mainstream researchers? The answer is simple: genetics. When scientists began analyzing DNA from ancient Native American remains, they found exactly what you'd expect if the Americas were populated from Asia. The genetic markers match East Asian and Siberian populations. Ancient Native Americans carry genetic signatures from people who lived near the Bering Strait, from groups that migrated through Beringia. What they don't carry is European DNA, no genetic evidence of Solutrean ancestry, no markers from Ice Age European populations, nothing. If there had been a significant migration from Europe to America 20,000 years ago, we should see European genetic markers in Native American populations, even if they're faint, even if they've been mostly diluted by later Asian migrations. But we don't. The genetic evidence is crystal clear. The ancestors of Native Americans came from Asia, not Europe. The Solutrean hypothesis proponents have tried to explain this away. Maybe the European migrants were wiped out before they could pass on their genes. Maybe they were completely replaced by later Asian arrivals. Maybe they were just too small a population to leave a lasting genetic signature. But these explanations require increasingly improbable scenarios. You're asking us to believe that Europeans made it to America, survived long enough to establish the Clovis technology across the entire continent, but then completely disappeared without leaving any genetic trace whatsoever. That's a lot of coincidences stacked on top of each other. There's also the timing problem. The Solutrean culture in Europe disappeared around 17,000 years ago. The Clovis culture in America appears around 13,000 years ago. That's a 4,000-year gap. If Clovis technology came from Solutrean migrants, where were they during those 4,000 years? Why don't we find Solutrean-style tools from that intermediate period? Most mainstream archaeologists now think the similarities between Solutrean and Clovis tools are either coincidental or result from basic principles of effective stone tool design. There are only so many ways to make a good spear point. If you're working with the same materials and solving the same problems, you might end up with similar solutions, even if you're on opposite sides of the ocean. But here's where this gets uncomfortable. The Solutrean hypothesis has become entangled with modern politics in ways that have nothing to do with the actual archaeological evidence. Some people have latched onto it because they like the idea that Europeans were in America first, that European ancestry can claim some kind of primacy in the Americas. This has made the whole topic toxic, radioactive. Archaeologists who even mention the Solutrean hypothesis risk being accused of promoting a political agenda, of trying to undermine Native American claims to being the first inhabitants of the continent. This is unfortunate because it means a potentially interesting scientific question can't be examined dispassionately. Maybe the Solutrean hypothesis is completely wrong. The genetic evidence certainly suggests it is, but the fact that it's become politically charged means researchers are often reluctant to even discuss it, which isn't how science is supposed to work. The controversy reveals something important about archaeology in the 21st century. The past isn't just the past. It's constantly being used to justify present-day claims about identity, ownership, and belonging. Who was here first matters to people today in ways that shape politics, law, and culture. Native American tribes understandably see attempts to prove European primacy in the Americas as attacks on their heritage and sovereignty. European nationalists see the Solutrean hypothesis as validation of their own importance. Archaeologists are caught in the middle, trying to do science while navigating these political minefields. The truth, as usual, is probably more complicated than any single hypothesis. The peopling of the Americas likely involved multiple migrations from multiple directions over many thousands of years. The genetic evidence strongly supports an Asian origin for most Native American ancestry, but that doesn't mean there couldn't have been earlier, failed attempts at colonization from other directions. Those earlier groups might have left stone tools but no descendants. Or maybe the similarities between Solutrean and Clovis tools really are just coincidence. Maybe ancient toolmakers, working independently on opposite sides of the ocean, discovered the same effective techniques through trial and error and practical experience. What we can say for certain is that the Solutrean hypothesis, as originally proposed, doesn't hold up to genetic scrutiny. Native Americans are descended from Asian populations, not European ones. The DNA doesn't lie. But the controversy surrounding this hypothesis teaches us something valuable about how archaeology works in the modern world. Every discovery, every theory, every interpretation gets filtered through contemporary concerns about identity and politics. The past can never be purely objective because we always view it through the lens of the present. And sometimes the most interesting thing about a controversial theory isn't whether it's right or wrong, but why it generates so much passion in the first place. What it reveals about what people want to believe, about what stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. By the time those first footprints were pressed into the mud at White Sands, the world was already crowded with ghosts. Not the supernatural kind, the genetic kind. Inside every person listening to this, tucked quietly into your chromosomes, are fragments of DNA that do not belong to Homo sapiens alone. Little sequences of code that came from other kinds of humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans. And maybe, if the most controversial evidence is right, from human groups we haven't even named yet. For most of the 20th century, the story was simple. There was us modern humans. Before us, there were other hominins like Neanderthals. We replaced them. End of story. Then geneticists started pulling DNA out of ancient bones, and the story fell apart. When researchers sequenced the Neanderthal genome in the early 2000s, they expected to find a completely separate branch, a dead end with no survivors. Instead, they found something unsettling. Neanderthals weren't gone. They were inside us. Every person of non-African ancestry alive today carries roughly 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Not as a fossil, not as a relic, but as living, functional genes that influence things like your immune system, your skin, even how you respond to certain diseases. People with indigenous ancestry from the Americas share that same Neanderthal signal, inherited from ancestors who met Neanderthals in Eurasia long before anyone crossed into the New World. That was the first revelation. Then came the second, even stranger. In a remote cave in Siberia called Denisova Cave, archaeologists found a single finger bone, just one, a sliver of a pinky from a girl who lived more than 50,000 years ago. They expected it to belong to a Neanderthal. The cave already had Neanderthal remains in it. That made sense. But when they sequenced the DNA, it wasn't Neanderthal, and it wasn't modern human. It was something else, a sister species to the Neanderthals, closely related but distinct, a human branch nobody had ever seen before. They named them after the cave, Denisovans. For a while, Denisovans were almost like a rumour, a handful of teeth, a fragment of jaw from Tibet, a bit of skull, no complete skeletons, no reconstructed faces, just scattered bones and a torrent of genetic data. But that DNA told an incredible story. Denisovans had been widespread across Asia, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, for hundreds of thousands of years. They weren't a marginal group. They were major players, and like Neanderthals, they had children with our ancestors. Today, people in Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan DNA. Indigenous Australians, Papuans, and some indigenous groups in the Philippines can have 4 or even 5% Denisovan ancestry. East Asians, Polynesians, Native Americans, smaller amounts, but still there, which means something strange. The ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas were already carrying Denisovan genes before they ever reached Beringia, before they ever saw mammoths grazing on the ancient plains of Alaska. Pieces of a vanished human species walked into the Americas inside the bodies of the first modern humans who arrived. In Tibet, a Denisovan-derived gene helps people handle life in the thin air of the high plateau. In Melanesia, Denisovan genes tune the immune system to new pathogens. In the Americas, the legacy is more subtle. Tiny shifts in metabolism, immunity, adaptation to cold, all quietly inherited from encounters that happened far away, long before the first footprints in American sand. So when we ask, who were the first Americans, the answer is already complicated. Even if the first people here were fully modern Homo sapiens, they were not genetically pure. They were mosaics, part Homo sapiens, part Neanderthal, part Denisovan. But there's a deeper, more unsettling question. What if the first Americans weren't even fully modern humans at all? What if, long before our species set foot here, another kind of human had already come and gone? Now we enter the realm of possibility and controversy. If Denisovans ranged across Asia, if some of them learned to cross open water to reach islands in Indonesia and perhaps beyond, it's natural to wonder, could Denisovans, or another archaic human group, have reached the Americas tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived? We don't have a Denisovan skull from Alaska. We don't have Neanderthal tools from California. Archaeology, as it stands, does not give us a confirmed archaic human campsite in the Americas, but genetics hints at something strange. When scientists analysed ancient and modern DNA from Native American and Siberian populations, they found signals that didn't match Neanderthals, didn't match Denisovans, didn't match any known group. They called them ghost populations, not because they were magical, but because they existed as clear genetic shadows without a body attached. A hint of interbreeding with an unknown human lineage somewhere in deep Eurasian prehistory. One study suggested that some Amazonian groups carry a tiny fraction of ancestry related to a mysterious population that split off from other non-African humans extremely early, maybe 40,000 or 50,000 years ago. Another line of research points to multiple waves of population mixing in Siberia, involving groups we've never directly sampled. These ghost populations could be deeply divergent branches of Homo sapiens. They could be relatives of Denisovans. They could be entirely separate archaic humans we haven't found yet. Whatever they were, their genes travelled. Some of them ended up in the ancestors of indigenous Americans. So inside the genomes of people in the Amazon, the Arctic, the Great Plains, there may be echoes of strangers whose faces we've never seen, whose bones we've never held, whose tools we've never dug up. If ghosts are written into the DNA of the people who eventually reach the Americas, could those ghostly humans have been here first? This is where archaeology tries to step in, and where things get very contentious. Consider a place called the Cerruti Mastodon site near San Diego, California. In the 1990s, highway crews were widening a road and accidentally exposed the bones of a mastodon, one of those elephant-like animals that roamed North America during the Ice Age. The site was carefully excavated and then largely forgotten. Decades later, a team of researchers re-examined the material with fresh eyes. They noticed strange patterns. Big bones and teeth seemed to have been broken in ways that looked deliberate, as if someone had hammered them open to get at the marrow inside. Large stones nearby looked like they'd been used as anvils and hammers. In 2017, the team published a bombshell claim. Based on uranium series dating of the bones, they argued that humans, or at least some kind of hominin, had been at that site around 130,000 years ago. Not 13,000, 130,000. If that date is right, it blows up almost everything about the peopling of the Americas. It would mean someone reached California more than 100,000 years before Clovis. Long before the Bering Land Bridge migration that most models rely on. Long before modern humans are even solidly documented in East Asia. Who could those toolmakers have been? Modern humans, pushed far earlier into the New World than we ever imagined. Neanderthals, wandering across a frozen Arctic corridor. Denisovans, extending their mysterious range across the Pacific. Or some other archaic humans entirely, now completely vanished. The paper never answered that. It just showed broken bones fractured in ways that, according to the authors, matched human stone tool activity rather than the crush of natural sediment or heavy machinery. The reaction from the scientific community was skeptical, to put it gently. Critics pointed out that rocks can break bones through natural processes too. Heavy equipment at the construction site might have disturbed the layers. No stone tools were found, only battered cobbles that might be natural. And most importantly, there is no supporting evidence from that time period anywhere else in the Americas. No campsites, no fire pits, no butchered animal bones from other locations. If hominins were really in California 130,000 years ago, where are they in Alaska, in Yukon, in Siberia? Why does the trail begin and end in a single controversial site? For now, the Cerati mastodon remains a tantalizing outlier, a possibility, a maybe. Enough to keep people awake at night, imagining Neanderthals standing under California stars, but far from accepted fact. And Cerruti isn't the only site whispering about an impossibly ancient human presence. Far to the south, in central Mexico, lies another enigmatic place, Hueyatlaco, near the modern city of Puebla. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavated stone tools there, blades and scrapers that looked unmistakably human-made, in layers associated with extinct animals. When they tried to date the site, the results were shocking. Some methods suggested the tools were more than 200,000 years old. Others pointed to around 250,000. Even the more conservative estimates placed them at over 100,000 years. If true, Hueyatlaco would mean hominins living in central Mexico long before Homo sapiens is known to have spread widely across Eurasia, long before any accepted migration into the Americas. It would force us to consider pre-sapiens explorers crossing oceans, or ancient land bridges we haven't fully modelled. The response, again, was intense pushback. Many geologists argue the dating was flawed, that the layers had been disturbed, that younger tools had slipped into older sediments. Others pointed out inconsistencies in the stratigraphy, the way the layers were arranged. The original excavators stood by their results, but the controversy grew so heated that work at the site essentially stopped. For decades, Hueyatlaco has hovered at the edge of respectability, cited mostly as a cautionary tale, too old, too strange, too far outside the framework, Cerati mastodon, Hueyatlaco. A few other scattered claims in Brazil and other parts of the Americas, each hinting at deep antiquity, each fiercely debated. Taken together, they form a pattern of possibility, but not yet a solid story. It's tempting to weave them into a grand narrative. Denisovan sailors, following coastlines down the Pacific Rim, camping on beaches that would one day be California and Chile. Neanderthal hunters tracking herds across a frozen Beringia, leaving footprints in snow that melted away 120,000 years ago. Ghost populations, unknown branches of the human family tree, reaching the Americas in waves we've barely begun to imagine. But for now, these are thought experiments, speculations. The genetic hints of ghost populations are real, but they mostly point to ancient events in Eurasia. The archaeological claims for very early humans in the Americas are intriguing, but they're not widely accepted. They could be signs of something revolutionary. They could be misinterpretations of complex geology. Science moves slowly here, because it has to. We know that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans. We know that their genes flowed into the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas. We know that those ancient encounters shaped how the first Americans' bodies responded to new climates, new diseases, new foods. We also know that our family tree is messier than we ever imagined. Not a clean, branching diagram, but a tangled web of crossings and recrossings, with ghostly branches that appear only as faint genetic echoes. Could Denisovans have gazed across a Pleistocene shoreline toward a distant American coast? Could some other archaic humans have walked these continents long before Homo sapiens? Maybe. Right now the evidence is a set of quiet whispers, not a chorus. A few anomalous sites, a handful of controversial dates, the absence of clear, repeated patterns that would turn mystery into history. So we hold the question gently. The first Americans, as far as most evidence shows, were modern humans. But they were not alone in the deeper story that led to them. They carried with them Neanderthal genes, Denisovan genes, and perhaps the faintest traces of other unnamed ancestors. When they crossed into this new world, they brought all those ghosts along, and as we follow their trail through skulls, skeletons, and ancient graves, the mystery only deepens. The story begins, not in the Ice Age, but on a hot July day in 1996. Two college students are watching a hydroplane race on the Columbia River in Kennewick, Washington. The water level is low. Erosion has chewed away at the riverbank, exposing layers of mud and gravel that haven't seen sunlight in millennia. One of the students wades into the shallows and stumbles over something hard. At first he thinks it's just a rock. Then he looks closer. It's a human skull. Police are called. The area is taped off. Everyone assumes it's a recent death. Maybe a drowning, maybe something darker. The coroner takes a look, expecting to open a modern forensic case. But as the skull is cleaned, something becomes obvious. This isn't recent. The bone is weathered, heavily mineralized. A stone spear point is lodged in the hip, and the teeth and cranial sutures say this person lived thousands of years ago. Radiocarbon dating gives a number that shocks everyone involved. About 9,000 years before present. This is not just a skeleton. This is one of the oldest, most complete human remains ever found in North America. He will come to be known by many names, to scientists, Kennewick Man, the ancient one, to local native nations, an ancestor, a relative, a person who never stopped belonging to their land, and almost immediately his bones become a battlefield, not just of law and politics, but of what it means to belong to a place, and of how much diversity the first Americans really had. When the skull is first examined, a pattern of reactions begins that will define the Skull Wars. Some early observers, mostly physical anthropologists trained on Old World skull collections, say something they think is purely descriptive, but that will have enormous consequences. They say, he doesn't look Native American. The shape of the face, the narrow nose, the cranial proportions. They claim these are more similar to peoples from Northeast Asia, to the Ainu of Japan, even to some European populations, than to the modern Native Americans they're used to seeing in their reference sets. And in the 1990s, in American anthropology, that kind of comment doesn't just stay technical. It resonates with old, dangerous ideas. Ideas that will feed fringe theories about Caucasoid ancient Americans. Ideas that some groups will seize upon to argue that the first people here weren't the ancestors of modern tribes at all. The skeleton, lying quietly in a storage box, has no idea that the shape of his cheekbones is about to be dragged into court. Legally, everything revolves around a law passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or an AGPRA. It says in essence that Native American human remains and sacred objects held in museums and federal collections must, when possible, be returned to their tribes. It's a response to centuries of grave robbing, museum collecting, and scientific study carried out without consent. A small, partial attempt at repair. So when the age of Kennewick Man is confirmed, 5 local tribes, including the Umatilla, Yakama, Nez Perce and others, say something simple and powerful. He is ours, not as property, as family. They request that he be reburied according to their traditions without further disturbance. But a group of scientists, many of them prominent in the field, see the skeleton differently. To them, This is a once-in-a-lifetime find, a chance to understand what people looked like in the earliest Holocene, to study diet, injuries, disease, migration patterns. They file suit against the US government to gain the right to study the remains. They argue that under Nagpra you have to show some kind of cultural affiliation with a modern tribe before you can claim remains. And they say, we can't do that here. He's too old. He doesn't look like modern Native Americans. The evidence of connection, they insist, is insufficient. The tribes answer with a different logic. We have been here since time immemorial. Our oral histories say so. Our relationship to this river, this landscape, is unbroken. If he lived here 9,000 years ago, he is our ancestor by definition. The fact that his skull doesn't match your museum collections is not our problem. The court case drags on for years. Lawyers debate bone measurements. Anthropologists testify about cranial indices. Tribal elders talk about responsibility to the dead. And all the while, the Ancient One lies in a storage facility, boxed, catalogued, waiting for a decision about who, if anyone, truly has the right to speak for him. Underneath the legal arguments is a deeper scientific assumption that turns out to be wrong. The assumption that you can look at a 9,000-year-old skull, compare it to modern populations, and declare that it belongs with one group and not another. That facial shape is fixed. That diversity now is what diversity always was. But the early Holocene wasn't like that. When researchers started looking not just at Kennewick, but at other ancient American skeletons, from Brazil, Mexico, Florida, and beyond, a pattern emerged. These early skulls are all over the map. Some are broad-faced and rounded, some are long and narrow, some resemble modern Native American averages, others look more like populations from the Pacific Rim, or even vaguely European when viewed through the biased lens of old racial categories. Yet when DNA, where available, can be extracted and sequenced, a quieter, more consistent story appears. Genetically, they are all deeply Native American. They share ancestry with modern indigenous peoples of the Americas. The bones say, we look like everything. The DNA says, we belong to here. In Kennewick's case, it takes technology itself time to catch up. When the lawsuits are being argued, ancient DNA work is still in its early days. The bone preservation is tricky. Contamination is a constant danger. For years, the genetic story of the Ancient One remained silent. Meanwhile, the skull measurements and facial reconstructions keep getting drawn into public debates they were never designed to settle. Some reconstructions give him a vaguely European appearance. They circulate in media, on websites, in books, stripped of caveats, stripped of uncertainty. They fuel narratives that indigenous people rightly see as threats, narratives suggesting that their claim to this land might be secondary, that someone else was here first. But science doesn't stand still. By the early 2010s, new techniques for extracting and sequencing DNA from ancient bones become available. The same revolution that unlocks Neanderthal genomes and Denisovan finger bones is now being applied to skeletons much more recent, much closer to the present. In 2015, a team manages to get enough genetic material from Kennewick's bones to run a full analysis. When the results come back, they cut through decades of speculation with almost eerie simplicity. The Ancient One is most closely related to modern Native Americans. More specifically, he shows strong genetic affinity to tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Among them, some of the very tribes that had claimed him as an ancestor from the beginning. The skull shape had misled. The DNA had not. The tribes had been saying all along, he is one of us. Genetics at last agreed. After the genetic evidence is published, the legal landscape shifts. The government recognizes that under NIGBRA, cultural affiliation has been established. The arguments about cranial measurements fall away. In 2017, more than 20 years after his discovery, the Ancient One is finally returned to the tribes. He's reburied in a private, undisclosed ceremony. No cameras, no scientific instruments, just prayers, songs, and the quiet closing of a circle that had been open for 9 millennia. The skull wars, at least in this chapter, end not with a dramatic courtroom verdict, but with a simple act of respect. A human being is allowed to rest. But the scientific questions his bones raised remain. Why did he look so different from many modern Native Americans? Why do early American skulls from north to south show such a wide range of shapes? What does this say about how the first Americans arrived, and how they changed once they were here? There are a few possibilities. One is that the first people into the Americas carried a lot more morphological diversity than we see in later populations. Remember, the small group that crossed from Siberia into Beringia didn't come from a uniform, homogeneous population. They were already the product of multiple ancestral streams in Northeast Asia, each with its own subtle cranial tendencies. When you then push a small, varied group through the harsh filters of Ice Age survival, you can get lineages where facial structures diverge rapidly, in many directions at once. Another possibility is multiple migration waves. Not just one founding group moving south, but several pulses of people entering the Americas over thousands of years, some hugging the coast, others moving through interior corridors, still others arriving later. These waves might have met, mixed, or, in some cases, died out without leaving direct descendants in the modern gene pool. In that scenario, some of the unusual skull shapes we see could be echoes of populations that no longer exist as distinct genetic lineages, lost branches of the American family tree, their genomes dissolved into others, their faces preserved only in bone. A third factor is rapid local evolution. Bone is living tissue. It responds to diet, climate, activity patterns. A shift from hunting megafauna on open plains to gathering shellfish along cold, windy coasts can, over thousands of years, subtly reshape jaws, nasal cavities, and cranial vaults. The same genome, expressed under different environmental and cultural pressures, can yield skulls that look surprisingly distinct. Add them together. Diverse founders, multiple waves, local adaptation, and sheer randomness, and the early Americas become a kaleidoscope of faces, all part of the same broad founding population, all connected at the genetic level, but visually, astonishingly varied. Kennewick Man sits at the centre of this picture as a kind of reminder, that you can't read deep ancestry off a face as if it were a barcode, that the categories of looks native, looks European, looks Asian are blunt modern constructs, poorly suited to a world where populations were smaller, more fluid, more experimental, and a reminder that even when the science is fascinating, there are people for whom these bones are not data points. They are grandmothers and grandfathers. The Skull Wars exposed how easily scientific curiosity can slide into something that feels, to indigenous communities, like yet another form of taking. For scientists, ancient skeletons are precious because they are rare windows into the past. For native nations, they are precious because they are not things. They are persons who lived, loved, suffered and died, and who have relatives still walking the earth. The Kennewick case forced anthropology to confront this tension directly. Who has the right to ask questions of the dead? How many questions are enough? When does knowledge stop justifying more cutting, more sampling, more disturbance? There's no easy, universal answer. But the resolution of Kennewick's story suggests a path, one where science continues, but not as an automatic entitlement, as a negotiation, a partnership, where indigenous rights and knowledge are not obstacles to research, but part of the framework that makes research legitimate in the first place. And in a way that mirrors the story we saw with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Multiple human groups, interacting, overlapping, sharing genes and ideas, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. In the modern world, multiple ways of knowing, Western science, indigenous oral history, legal structures, ethical traditions, also collide and overlap. Sometimes they clash, like the hammers in that evolutionary whack-a-mole game. Sometimes they find ways to coexist. Kennewick Man stood at the crossroads of these forces. A single skeleton, emerging from a riverbank, forced us to reconsider what ancient Americans looked like, how many different groups might have roamed these continents, and how much diversity was lost before written history began. He also forced us to ask, in the rush to answer those questions, who gets to decide what happens to the dead? As we move deeper into the continent's past, as we begin sequencing more ancient genomes, as we uncover more skulls that don't fit our expectations, that intersection of science, ethics, and indigenous rights won't go away. It will become more important. The bones we study are not just clues to migration routes and population splits. They are also tests of whether, in trying to understand the first Americans, we can avoid repeating the mistakes we made with their descendants. And with that in mind, we can turn from the shape of ancient faces to the code written inside their cells. Because if skulls can mislead us, DNA can sometimes bring a different kind of clarity. The genetic revolution is about to open an entirely new window on the peopling of the Americas. Genetics is where the story stops being guesswork and starts being testable. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough that we can see outlines where before there was only fog. For most of the 20th century, everything about the first Americans came from bones, stones, and a lot of arguments. Then, quietly, in cold rooms full of humming machines, that changed. Ancient DNA technology is one of the strangest things humans have ever invented. Imagine taking a bone that's been lying in the ground for 10,000 years, grinding a tiny piece of it into powder, and asking it to tell you its life story. For a long time, that was science fiction. DNA decays. It breaks into fragments, gets contaminated by bacteria, seeps into the soil. Early attempts gave messy, unreliable results, but then methods improved. Clean rooms got cleaner, sequencing got faster and cheaper. Algorithms learned how to sort ancient human DNA from the noise of microbes and modern contamination. Suddenly, skeletons that had been silent for millennia started talking, and what they said about the first Americans was nothing like the neat, simple picture many people had grown comfortable with. You can think of DNA as a slow-moving clock. Every generation, tiny random changes accumulate. Compare two populations, and the pattern of those changes tells you roughly how long ago their ancestors split. Not the exact village, not the precise number of people, but the order of events, the branching of the tree. When geneticists began comparing Native American DNA to populations around the world, one thing stood out immediately. The closest relatives weren't in Europe. They weren't in Africa. They were in Northeast Asia, Siberia, the Russian Far East, parts of northern China. Again and again the signal came back the same. Native Americans are deeply, consistently linked to ancient and modern East Asians. But the details were stranger. Based on those genetic clocks, the founding population that would eventually give rise to all indigenous peoples of the Americas seems to have split from other East Asian-related groups, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 years ago. Not 12,000, not 15,000. Tens of thousands of years before the Clovis culture appears in North America. Long before those white sands footprints were pressed into wet lake mud. That meant something important. If the ancestors of Native Americans split from their Asian cousins around 25 to 30,000 years ago, but the earliest widely accepted archaeological sites in the Americas are much younger than that, then those ancestors had to be somewhere for a very long time. That somewhere is the basis of one of the most interesting ideas in this whole story, the Beringian standstill. During the height of the last ice age, sea levels were lower, exposing a vast landmass between Siberia and Alaska. Not a little bridge you could run across in an afternoon, but a region the size of a small continent. Grassy steppe, patches of forest, herds of mammoth and bison, Beringia. The Beringian standstill hypothesis proposes that the ancestors of Native Americans didn't just sprint across this land and vanish into the interior of the continent. Instead, they lingered for thousands of years, isolated, trapped, in a sense, between walls of ice to the east and south and harsh environments to the west. A population caught in a frozen waiting room. Their DNA seems to carry this story. Native American lineages form their own distinct branch, separate from other East Asian groups, but they also show signs of having been small and relatively isolated for a long stretch of time. A genetic echo of a people living in one broad region, growing slowly, adapting to a cold, windswept world, while the ice sheets reached their maximum and then began to retreat. When the climate shifted and the ice margins pulled back, those Beringian descendants finally had new options. Some followed the coast, moving along kelp forests and rich marine ecosystems. Others slipped through ice-free corridors in the interior. However they came, they brought with them a genetic signature that still defines the vast majority of indigenous peoples from Alaska to Patagonia. But the DNA doesn't only speak of a single wave, it whispers of eddies, backflows, and side channels. When geneticists looked more closely, they began to notice patterns that didn't fit a simple one migration, one population model. Some Native American groups in North America show evidence of slightly different ancestry components than some groups in South America. Ancient skeletons from different time periods don't always match the same tidy profile. There were hints of additional waves of people entering the Americas later, merging with those who were already there, and even hints of people moving in the opposite direction, back toward Asia. These back migrations are subtle, but they matter. Some modern Siberian populations carry genetic traces that look distinctly Native American, suggesting that not everyone who headed east stayed east. Some groups may have moved back onto the Asian side of Beringia over thousands of years, carrying American-born lineages with them. Within the Americas, the story is also layered. Genetic studies point to at least two major branches of the original founding population. One that gave rise to most indigenous peoples in both North and South America, and another that seems more restricted to parts of northern North America. Over time, migrations, splits, and reunions created a tapestry of related but distinct groups, each with its own history, its own paths, its own adaptations. One of the most important pieces of this puzzle comes not from theory, but from a single heartbreaking grave in what is now Montana. In 1968, on a small ranch near the town of Wilsall, workers uncovered the burial of an infant. The child had died around 12,600 years ago, during the tail end of the Ice Age. He was laid to rest with great care, surrounded by finely made stone tools and red ochre. Archaeologists came to call him the Anzac Child, after the family that owned the land. For decades his bones sat in collections, silently bridging a gap between Clovis-era artifacts and living people. Then, in the 2010s, with the permission and cooperation of tribal representatives, scientists extracted DNA from his remains. What they found was astonishing. Genetically, the Anzac Child was clearly Native American. Not some lost European, not a mysterious stranger species, but a direct representative of the same broad lineage that still exists across the Americas today. His DNA showed close relationships to indigenous peoples in Central and South America, as well as North America. This meant that by 12,600 years ago, the descendants of that original Beringian population, had already spread far and wide across the continents and were part of the same family tree as living Native Americans. In other words, the people who made Clovis points in Montana were not a dead-end culture. They were ancestors. The Anzic genome also undercut some of the more speculative ideas about entirely separate early populations being wiped out and replaced by later arrivals. It didn't disprove all possibilities of earlier waves, but it clearly showed continuity. The faces of the past and the faces of the present are connected by unbroken genetic threads. But not all the threads are so straightforward. When researchers examine the genomes of some indigenous groups in the Amazon rainforest, they notice something very strange. A small portion of their ancestry seemed to resemble modern populations from Australasia, people from places like Papua New Guinea and parts of Australia, more than it resembled other Native American groups. This didn't mean that Australians somehow sailed directly to Brazil 13,000 years ago. The signal is subtle, and it doesn't match any known modern population exactly. Instead, it suggests that some ancient group, distantly related to the ancestors of today's Australasians, contributed genes to the ancestors of certain Amazonian peoples, and then vanished as a distinct population. Geneticists sometimes call this hypothetical group Population Y, from the Tupi word Wipiquera, meaning ancestor. We don't know where they lived. We don't know what languages they spoke or what their tools looked like. They could have branched off from other Asian populations before the main founding group that became Native Americans. They might have met and mixed with those founding populations in Siberia, in Beringia, or even within the Americas very early on. Wherever and whenever it happened, their traces remain. A quiet Australasian-like echo in the genomes of some Amazonian communities, hinting at encounters and journeys that have left no recognized bones, no clearly labelled archaeological sites, just a ghostly genetic fingerprint. This is the paradox of DNA. It can be exquisitely precise, down to the level of single mutations, and at the same time deeply mysterious. It can tell you that two people share an ancestor, but not what that ancestor believed, or what stories they told around the fire. As more ancient genomes are sequenced, from Alaska, from Mexico, from Brazil, from Patagonia, the picture becomes richer, not simpler. Some early individuals in North America show ancestry that branches near the base of the Native American tree, suggesting diversity very early in the peopling process. Others, thousands of years later, carry mixtures of once separate lineages, proving that human groups were meeting, trading, intermarrying, and reshaping each other's futures. Through all of this, one conclusion has become very hard to deny. Native Americans, in all their incredible diversity, ultimately descend primarily from populations in Northeast Asia. The old arguments that tried to place their deepest origins in Europe or elsewhere have steadily eroded under the weight of genetic evidence. The DNA points in one broad direction across the Pacific, to Siberia, to East Asia, to Beringia. But that doesn't mean the story is simple, or that it can be summarized as they just walked over the bridge once and that was that. Instead, genetics has revealed a story of long isolation and sudden expansion, of multiple waves and quiet returns, of lost branches and ghost populations that left no obvious trace except in the cells of living people. It's also important to remember something else. Genes are not destiny. They don't tell you who owns a story or how that story should be told. They are one line of evidence among many. Archaeology, linguistics, oral traditions, and lived experience all carry truths that DNA alone can't capture. Still, the genetic revelations of the last few decades have done something profound. They have connected ancient children like the one buried at Anzic to modern communities in a direct, tangible way. They have shown that the first Americans were not a mysterious, unrelated species that vanished without a trace, but the direct ancestors of indigenous peoples whose cultures, languages and histories continue today. And they have reminded us that the peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a process stretching over tens of thousands of years, shaped by ice and ocean, by chance and adaptation, by separation and reunion. While you drift toward sleep, you can imagine those genetic lineages not as lines on a chart, but as rivers, a main channel flowing from Asia into the New World, tributaries splitting and merging, hidden springs feeding in from ghost populations we only know from faint signals, back currents swirling out and then returning centuries later. Every person alive in the Americas today carries in their cells a record of that long, winding journey, a journey that began in the deep cold of the north, paused for millennia on a vanished land between continents, and then fanned out across forests, mountains, prairies, and coasts. A journey that, thanks to ancient DNA, we are finally beginning to see, if only in glimpses. But genes can tell us only who was here and how they were related. To understand what life actually felt like for those first Americans, the sounds, the dangers, the animals that walked beside them, we have to turn to another kind of evidence entirely. Picture this. You open your eyes on a cold morning, not in Africa, not in Eurasia, but in a world that doesn't exist anymore. A continent still half frozen from the last glacial maximum. The air is crisp, sharper than anything you've ever felt. Your breath comes out in white clouds and instantly vanishes into the pre-dawn dark. Above you, the sky is so clear you can see stars right down to the horizon, like someone spilled crushed ice across black velvet. And stretching out in every direction as far as you can see is a world that might as well be alien. This is Pleistocene America, not the land of highways and skyscrapers and cornfields, a lost world of giants. On the open steppe, herds of mammoths move like slow-living hills, shaggy silhouettes against the snow, each one twice the size of anything you've ever hunted. Some are woolly mammoths, with thick hair and curved tusks that sweep almost back to their shoulders. Others are Columbian mammoths further south, taller, leaner, adapted to slightly warmer grasslands. In the forest beyond, mastodons browse among the conifers. They look like mammoths at a glance, but up close they're different. Shorter, stockier, with straighter tusks and different teeth. Built not for grazing open prairies, but for ripping branches and crushing leaves. If mammoths are the bison of this world, mastodons are the forest elephants. On the hillsides, shadows move that not human. A massive shape crosses a ridge and pauses, watching the mammoths with eyes that catch the faint light. American lions, larger than any African lion today, moving without fear. Packs of dire wolves trail the herds, heavier and more powerfully built than modern wolves, jaws made to crack bone. Saber-toothed cats lurk near watering holes, their front fangs so long they almost look impossible, like something dreamed up in a fever. And lumbering through the scrub, tearing at low vegetation with huge clawed forelimbs, are creatures you have no word for. Giant ground sloths, some as big as elephants. Slow but not helpless. A single swing of those claws could tear a human open from shoulder to hip. Beavers the size of black bears build lodges along the rivers. Armadillos as big as small cars, glyptodonts, trundle across the plains inside bony shells like living tanks. This is the America the first humans saw. Not a pristine wilderness waiting for us, but a crowded, dangerous, unbelievably rich ecosystem that had been shaping itself for millions of years, without any expectation that one more primate would arrive with fire, stone, and plans. When your ancestors first set foot here, whether by coastal routes along the Pacific kelp forests, or through an ice-free corridor that opened between massive continental glaciers, or by some path we still haven't found, they didn't just discover a new land. They stepped into someone else's world. And like every other world our species has ever entered, the first question was simple. Can we survive here? The evidence suggests they could, and fast. Archaeological sites scattered across both North and South America show signs of human megafauna interaction almost as soon as humans appear in the record. Not just the occasional scavenged carcass, but structured, repeated behavior. At a place like Denton, Colorado, mammoth bones lie in unusual arrangements, some clearly broken while still fresh, marrow-rich, likely butchered by humans. At Murray Springs in Arizona, you find mammoth remains associated with well-made spear points, burned areas, and processing debris. In the Great Plains, sites like Lang-Ferguson show mammoth bones split with tools, marks etched in patterns that no carnivore's teeth would make. Far to the south, at places like Arroyo Seco in Argentina, there are layers of bones from giant ground sloths, horses and mastodons with cut marks, impact fractures, and evidence of controlled fire. You can almost reconstruct the scenes. A small group of hunters, wrapped in hides, tracking a wounded mammoth for miles across windswept grassland. The animal, bleeding, slowing, stumbling, spear points of carefully knapped stone lodged deep in its muscles. The final encounter at a frozen creek. Shouts, coordinated movement, another rain of spears, then silence as the giant finally collapses. For your people, a kill like this isn't just food. It's survival for weeks, meat to dry and smoke, bones for tools, hide for clothing, tents, snowshoes, lashings, sinew for bowstrings, fat for lamps. A single mammoth can sustain a small band through the kind of winter that would kill you in days without adequate calories. Was this hunting, or was it opportunistic scavenging? The truth is, it was probably both. Sometimes the animals died in bogs or river crossings, and humans moved in later. Sometimes predators brought them down first, and clever scavengers with stone blades stole their share. But over time, the evidence becomes harder to explain away as mere opportunism. You find kill sites with multiple animals in a single place. Bone beds where mammoths or bison seem to have been driven into marshes or over low embankments, suggesting planned communal hunts. You find carefully crafted spear points lodged in vertebrae, pelvises, and ribs in ways that imply deliberate targeting of vital areas. And here's where things get even more interesting. There are hints, just hints, that humans weren't always just enemies of the megafauna. In some caves and rock shelters, certain bones appear to be arranged deliberately, not just discarded. Mammoth and mastodon bones used to build windbreaks or shelters. Repeated association of particular animals with possible ritual spaces. A few researchers have even speculated about early attempts at something like management or proto-domestication. Not in the sense of neatly fenced herds, but habitual patterns of following certain groups of animals, learning their migrations, perhaps guiding them into favourable terrain over and over. A kind of low-level landscape engineering long before formal herding emerged elsewhere in the world. We don't know how far this went. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered across thousands of miles and tens of thousands of years, but it suggests a relationship between humans and megafauna that was complex, dynamic, and constantly evolving. And then, abruptly in geological terms, the giants were gone. Between about 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, a huge proportion of the American megafauna disappears from the fossil record. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, American lions, dire wolves, glyptodonts, giant beavers, American camels, native horses, species that had weathered multiple previous ice ages simply vanish. Why? This is one of the great unresolved debates in science. On one side, there's climate. The end of the last ice age was a time of rapid, dramatic change. Glaciers retreated, sea levels rose, vegetation zones shifted hundreds of miles in a few thousand years, Animals that had evolved for cold open steppes suddenly found themselves in warming forests or shrinking grasslands. Many couldn't adapt fast enough. On the other side, there's us. The so-called overkill hypothesis suggests that even relatively small human populations, armed with cooperative hunting strategies and increasingly sophisticated tools, could have exerted enormous pressure on slow-breeding megafauna. A few extra deaths in each generation can push a population past its tipping point. And like most important questions in human evolution, the real answer might not be either or. It might be both. Climate stress pushing ecosystems to the edge, human hunting nudging vulnerable populations over the brink. Add in possible disease, habitat fragmentation, and competition with other species, and you get a picture of a world unravelling. But for the people living through it, this wasn't an abstract extinction event. It was daily life. Imagine you're born into a world where mammoths are common, their trails etched into the land like ancient roads. Your childhood stories are full of them. Your tool traditions are built around their bones and hides. Your social rituals revolve around the first successful mammoth hunt, the sharing of meat, the songs sung afterward. Then, within a few generations, they're rare. Then gone. You'd have to reinvent almost everything. Daily life for these first Americans wasn't a single experience. It depended on where you lived. In the far north, near the receding ice sheets, people followed caribou, muskox, and later, after the giants disappeared, smaller game and fish. They learned to build shelters partially sunk into the earth, lined with bone and hide, insulated against the killing winds. They refined clothing technology to an art, layered furs, carefully sewn with bone needles so no heat escaped. Along the Pacific coast, groups harvested shellfish, salmon and marine mammals, moving seasonally between rich estuaries and sheltered coves. They built boats, maybe simple dugouts at first, then more sophisticated watercraft, navigating kelp forests and rocky shorelines. Their world rhythm was the tide, the spawning runs, the migrations of seals and seabirds. In the interior plains, people followed herds across vast open spaces, not just mammoths and mastodons, but later bison and pronghorn. They learned to read the wind, the faintest tracks in dust or snow, the subtle changes in the sky that meant a blizzard was coming. Some camps were temporary, just a few days at a kill site. Others became seasonal hubs visited again and again, leaving behind thick layers of stone flakes, charcoal and bones. Further south, in what would one day be deserts, there were wetlands and grasslands rich with game. In the tropics of Central and South America, humans entered dense forests full of unfamiliar species, jaguars, tapirs, capybaras, monkeys. They had to invent new strategies, new tools, new ways of thinking almost from scratch. One continent, dozens of worlds. Over time, regional cultures blossomed. You can see it in the stone tools. Different shapes, different techniques, different choices of raw material. Some groups perfected long, elegant spear points, thinned to razor edges, fluted at the base so they could be hafted securely. Others focused on scrapers and knives optimized for hide working or plant processing. You can see it in the patterns of campsites. Some emphasize big game hunting. Others show more reliance on fish, shellfish, or small animals. Some have evidence of long-distance trade, exotic stones, shells carried hundreds of miles inland, pigments from far-off sources, networks of exchange quietly stitching together bands who might never meet face-to-face, but still depended on each other. These weren't people passively enduring a harsh world. They were actively researching it, experimenting, learning which plants could be eaten raw, which needed processing, which cured headaches, which stopped bleeding, testing rivers and lakes for fish runs, mapping seasonal changes in animal behavior. Every mistake had a cost. The wrong plant could kill you. Misjudging the ice on a river could sweep a child away. Underestimating a ground sloth or a cornered bison could mean shredded muscles and shattered bones. But the survivors didn't just accumulate scars, they accumulated knowledge. By the time mammoths were fading from the land, the first Americans had already diversified into a tapestry of cultures and lifeways adapted to almost every environment the continent could offer. Tundra, forest, prairie, coast, mountain, and jungle. The ingenuity that had carried their ancestors through the African bottleneck was still at work here, half a world away. New tools, new hunting strategies, new social arrangements, probably new languages, new myths, new ways of explaining why the world was changing and why the giants of their grandparents' stories no longer walked the earth. If you could stand with them at the edge of a meltwater lake, watching the last thin ice pan crack under a warming sun, you might feel something unexpected. Not just fear, not just struggle, wonder. Because however harsh it was, this was a world overflowing with life. Herds stretching to the horizon, predator tracks crisscrossing the snow, the smell of mammoth dung on the wind, the sound of thousands of birds rising from a marsh at once, turning the sky into a living cloud. The first Americans weren't walking into a blank space on a modern map. They were stepping into a lost America that no human will ever see again, a continent of monsters and marvels. And somehow, in the middle of all that danger and beauty, tiny bands of our relatives figured out how to live, how to track giants in the snow, how to cross frozen rivers in the dark, how to sing children to sleep under the rumble of distant thunder and the low, eerie calls of animals that today exist only as bones in museum drawers. When we dig those bones up and trace the cut marks on their surfaces, when we follow the patterns of old camps and fire pits and stone flakes, we're not just reconstructing ecology, we're remembering a meeting between a species forged in one of the worst climate catastrophes on Earth and a land that had never seen anything like us. What happened in that meeting, the hunts, the extinctions, the innovations, the quiet acts of daily survival, set the stage for everything that would follow. The rise of complex societies in the Americas, the stories carved into rock and woven into oral traditions, the genetic signatures still carried in the people of these continents today. And the mystery is still deepening. Because the more we learn about this lost world of mammoths and megafauna, the more we realize something unsettling. We still don't fully understand who those first Americans were, or how many different kinds of humans walked beside them, leaving only faint genetic echoes and fragmentary bones in the shadows of a vanished ice age. So now, here we are, at the end of this journey, staring back across tens of thousands of years, and the story we started with doesn't look anything like the story we end with. Once, the peopling of the Americas seemed simple. Clovis-first, one migration, one land bridge, case closed. You could draw it as a single arrow on a map and feel like you understood it. Now that arrow is shattered into a web. Instead of one clean migration, we see wave after wave. People slipping down an ice-free corridor, others gliding along a coastal Kelp Highway in boats we've never found. Possible Atlantic crossings hotly debated in academic papers. Denisovan echoes in the genomes of modern populations, ghost lineages that we can see in the DNA but not yet in the bones, skulls that don't fit neatly into any category we invented for them. What used to be a straight line has become a braided river, split into channels, looping and recombining, disappearing underground and resurfacing thousands of miles away. And the truth is, we're still only seeing fragments. We don't yet know who left the very first footprints on those ancient American shores. We don't know how many times humans came, or how many separate cultures rose and fell long before Clovis hunters napped their famous points. We don't know how many languages have vanished, how many mythologies were never written down, how many names are lost to time, When we talk about the first Americans, we're really talking about layers of mystery, footprints in evaporated lakes, stone tools beneath old assumptions, strands of DNA that whisper, someone was here, but we don't know their face yet. But even with all those gaps, one thing shines through clearly. Whoever they were incredibly adaptable. They followed retreating glaciers. They tracked herds across frozen plains and dense forests. They fished rich kelp forests along stormy coasts. They learned new plants, new climates, new dangers. They crossed mountain ranges, deserts, river systems the size of small seas. And they didn't just survive. They built stories, rituals, technologies, worlds. Understanding their migrations is really about understanding us. The same brain that calculated tides for a coastal crossing is the brain that built cities. The same creativity that turned mammoth bones into shelters is the creativity that paints art on cave walls or on digital screens. The same stubbornness that pushed families across the Bering Land Bridge or through the ice-free corridor or along the Pacific coast is the stubbornness that carries us through our own private winters. And through all of this, there is a deeper truth that matters more than any single theory about dates or roots. The descendants of those early peoples are still here. For thousands of generations, indigenous nations across the Americas have held on to land, language, and ceremony. They carry living memories, oral histories, sacred stories, place-based knowledge that stretch back in ways archaeology is only beginning to appreciate. When we talk about first Americans, we're not talking about vanished strangers. We're talking about the ancestors of real communities alive today, with their own perspectives on this history. So as we follow the science, it's important to remember, these aren't just puzzles to solve, they're human stories to respect. As you settle in now, maybe let your mind drift with those ancient travellers. Picture a small band standing on a windy shoreline, watching waves break on a coast no human has ever seen before. Picture children running beside mammoths in an Ice Age meadow. Picture canoes sliding through kelp forests under a sky full of unfamiliar stars. Somewhere in that long chain of journeys, someone took a step that eventually led to you. If you enjoyed wandering through this mystery tonight, you can gently tap like or subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next late-night expedition into deep time. If you feel like sharing, you can leave a comment telling us where in the world you're listening from, adding your own point to this vast map of human movement. And if you'd like to support the channel a little more, there's an optional YouTube membership available. It's never required, but always appreciated, and it helps us keep making these calm, curious dives into the past. For now, you don't need to solve anything. The unanswered questions will still be here tomorrow. Let the timelines blur, let the maps fade, let the glaciers and coastlines dissolve into the dark. You can close your eyes and imagine the crunch of ancient snow, the hush of a pine forest, the soft press of bare feet into wet sand 20,000 years ago. Thank you for spending this time here at the edge of what we know. Sleep peacefully. May your dreams be full of long journeys, distant horizons, and the quiet footsteps of ancestors walking beside you in the dark,